Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. They say the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. I never believed that until the night I held a dying baby in my arms and watched a man's entire world crumble around a single, desperate act of mercy. My name is Sarah, and at 52, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. 20 years as a head nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit at Johns Hopkins had taught me to navigate crisis with steady hands and a calm heart. But nothing had prepared me for the storm that would engulf my life when I accepted a position with the Davenport family. The tragedy that brought me to their doorstep happened exactly 13 months before that fateful night. My daughter Emma and my 3-week-old grandson Marcus were driving home from a pediatric appointment when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact was instantaneous. They said, no suffering. But for me, the mother and grandmother left behind, the suffering had only just begun. What the doctors explained in those hollow days following the funeral was something I had only read about in medical journals. Pseudochiassis lactation, they called it. The profound grief and trauma of losing both my daughter and grandson had triggered my body to produce milk again, as if my maternal instincts were desperately trying to fill a void that could never be filled. For months, I tried everything to stop it. Nothing worked. The Davenport mansion sat like a fortress on 20 acres of manicured grounds in Connecticut. Its Gothic Revival architecture, both beautiful and intimidating. I had taken the position as a private caregiver for baby Leo, not because I needed the money, but because I needed purpose. When Eleanor Davenport, the family matriarch, contacted me through a discreet agency, something in her voice told me this was where I needed to be. Richard Davenport was not what I expected. At 45, he possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that had built a tech empire worth billions, but grief had carved deep lines around his eyes. His wife, Catherine, had died just 6 months after Leo's birth, and the weight of single parenthood seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The baby, Leo, was small for his age, perhaps 7 months old when I arrived, with his father's dark hair and the most piercing blue eyes I had ever seen. He had been struggling to gain weight and often seemed listless during feeding. As I held him for the first time, something deep in my chest recognized his need with an almost painful clarity. Eleanor Davenport commanded respect without raising her voice. At 75, she moved through the mansion with grace, but there was a sadness in her eyes that spoke of losses beyond her daughter-in-law's death. The household staff was small but efficient. Jessica, the head housekeeper, was 28 and beautiful in the way that made men stumble over their words. There was something about her smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I noticed how her gaze would linger on Richard whenever he was in the room. My first few weeks were peaceful. I settled into a routine with Leo, who began to thrive under consistent care. The mansion felt like a mausoleum in those early days. Richard left before dawn and rarely returned before Leo's bedtime. I began to notice small things that troubled me about Jessica. The way she would interrupt when Eleanor and I were talking, always with some urgent household matter. The way she seemed to appear whenever I was caring for Leo, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was during my 3rd week that Leo had his first serious episode. I had just finished giving him his evening bottle when his breathing became labored and his lips took on a bluish tint. His little body went rigid, then limp, and I realized immediately that he was going into respiratory distress. My training kicked in without conscious thought, but he was deteriorating rapidly. In that moment, faced with a dying infant and no time to wait for paramedics, my body made the decision my mind couldn't process. I lifted my shirt and guided Leo to my breast. The milk came immediately, and within seconds he was nursing, his breathing stabilizing, his color returning to normal. It was the most natural thing in the world, and the most taboo. That was how Richard found us 20 minutes later. The sound of his footsteps should have been my warning, but I was so focused on Leo's recovery that I didn't hear him approach. When I looked up and saw Richard standing in the doorway, his face was a mask of absolute horror and rage. For a moment, neither of us moved. Leo continued nursing peacefully, completely oblivious to the storm about to break. Then Richard exploded. He lunged forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might try to rip Leo away from me. Instead, he stopped just short, his whole body trembling with fury. The words that came out of his mouth were like physical blows. Sick, perverted, disgusting, predator. He accused me of taking advantage of his infant son, of satisfying some twisted maternal fantasy at Leo's expense. His voice carried through the mansion like a thunderclap, and within seconds Jessica appeared, her eyes wide with carefully practiced shock. I tried to explain, tried to tell him that Leo had been in respiratory distress, that I had saved his life. But Richard was beyond reason. Jessica's voice joined his, full of righteous indignation. She suggested calling the police, mentioning something about inappropriate contact with a minor, and I watched in disbelief as the situation spiraled completely out of control. Eleanor arrived just as Richard was shouting for security. She took one look at the scene, at Leo peaceful in my arms, at the hysteria on Richard's face, and her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. She ordered the security guards to step back, told Jessica to return to her duties, and fixed her son with a stare that could have frozen fire. But the damage was done. Richard declared that I would be confined to the staff quarters until his lawyers could determine what legal action to take. The staff quarters were comfortable enough, but being locked in felt like a return to the darkest days after Emma and Marcus died. That first night of my imprisonment, Eleanor came to see me. She sat across from me and waited for me to speak. I told her everything. About Emma and Marcus, about the medical condition that had left my body producing milk, about my 20 years of experience in neonatal care and the dozens of babies I had helped save. I explained exactly what had happened with Leo, how his breathing had stopped, how in that moment of crisis, my instincts had taken over. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told me about Catherine, about how Richard's wife had died, not from simple postpartum depression, as the family had publicly claimed, but under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Catherine had been terrified of something in the weeks before her death, too frightened to confide in anyone except her private recordings. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small key, old and ornate. "Catherine's study?" she whispered. Everything Catherine was too afraid to say out loud, she recorded. If you can find those recordings, you might find the truth about what really happened to her. The next morning, I heard Leo crying again, but this time the sound was different. Weak. Desperate. The cry of a baby in distress. I pressed my ear to the door and heard Jessica's voice in the hallway, speaking to someone on the phone about formula allergies and possible contamination. My blood ran cold as I realized what she was doing. Leo's formula was being tampered with, deliberately making him sick to support her narrative. That evening, when the house settled into quiet, I used Eleanor's key to slip out and make my way to Catherine's study. The room had been preserved exactly as she had left it. Books still open on the desk, a half-finished cup of tea sitting beside a small digital recorder. I found the device hidden inside a hollowed-out volume of poetry. Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper on the recordings, but her words were clear and devastating. She spoke about discovering irregularities in the household accounts, money being transferred to accounts Jessica controlled. She talked about finding love letters in Jessica's room, not addressed to any boyfriend, but to Richard himself. written in a style that suggested obsession rather than relationship. Most disturbing of all, Catherine had discovered references to other wealthy widowers Jessica had worked for, men who had died under suspicious circumstances after changing their wills. The final recording was made just days before Catherine's death. Her voice was shaking with terror as she described confronting Jessica about the financial discrepancies. Jessica had not denied anything. Instead, she had smiled and told Catherine that accidents happened all the time to young mothers suffering from postpartum depression. I was so absorbed in listening that I didn't hear footsteps until it was too late. The study door burst open and Richard stood there, his face contorted with rage. Jessica was right behind him. Her expression, a perfect mask of concern and triumph. Richard accused me of violating his privacy, of breaking into his dead wife's most sacred space to cover up my own crimes. He lunged for the recorder, and in the struggle that followed, it flew out of my hands and shattered against the marble fireplace. But I had managed to palm the memory card, sliding it into my pocket just before the device hit the floor. This time, Richard didn't just threaten to call the police. He did it. Within an hour, 2 officers were at the mansion, taking statements and examining the broken recorder. Jessica painted a picture of an unstable woman who had inappropriate contact with an infant and then broke into private property to destroy evidence. I tried to explain about Catherine's recordings, about Jessica's financial crimes, about Leo's respiratory distress, but without the intact recorder, I sounded like exactly what Jessica claimed I was. They didn't arrest me that night, but they made it clear that charges were being considered. Richard banned me from the property immediately, and I found myself standing on the front steps at midnight with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. Eleanor pressed a business card into my hand as the police car pulled away. Ben Carter, investigative journalist, the card read. I called Ben from my hotel room the next morning. His voice was rough with decades of cigarettes and cynicism. But when I mentioned the Davenport name, he became instantly alert. We met at a diner 40 miles from the mansion, and I told him everything I had discovered. Ben listened with the intensity of a man who had been waiting years for this conversation. He told me his own story then, about how he had investigated the Davenport family 15 years earlier for a piece about political corruption. He had uncovered evidence of criminal activity in Richard's father's Senate campaign. But before he could publish, his sources disappeared. His editor killed the story, and his career was systematically destroyed. Ben had never forgotten. And when I played Catherine's recordings from the memory card I had saved, his hands shook with something between rage and vindication. This was the break he had been waiting for. The chance to finally expose the rot at the heart of one of America's most powerful families. But first, we had to find proof that would hold up in court. Ben had kept detailed files from his original investigation, including information about Richard's older brother Daniel. The family had covered up Daniel's existence after he was institutionalized in the 1990s, claiming he had died in a car accident, when the truth was that he had been committed to a psychiatric facility for being gay, a fact that would have damaged his father's conservative political career. Finding Daniel took us 3 days of searching through old hospital records and homeless shelters. We finally located him at a transitional housing facility in downtown Hartford. And when I saw him, my heart broke. He was clearly Richard's brother, with the same dark hair and intelligent eyes, but 20 years of psychiatric medication and electroshock therapy had left him fragile and easily confused. The reunion between Daniel and Richard was devastating to witness. Richard's face, when he saw his brother, whom he had believed dead for decades, went through every stage of grief simultaneously. Daniel's response was a mixture of joy and bitter accusation. years of abandonment and betrayal, pouring out in broken sentences. With Daniel's testimony and Catherine's recordings, we had enough evidence to expose Jessica's crimes, but Ben wanted to do more than just see her arrested. He wanted to destroy her completely. The opportunity came at the annual Davenport Foundation Charity Gala, a high-profile event that drew media attention from around the world. Jessica had planned to use the gala as her moment of triumph. She intended to present evidence of Richard's alleged mental instability to the board of directors, positioning herself as the stable influence he needed. She had even arranged for reporters to be present, anticipating a dramatic announcement about Richard's need to step back from public life. Instead, she got the surprise of her life. Ben had worked with Eleanor to arrange for our evidence to be presented at exactly the moment Jessica began her performance. As she stood before the assembled guests and media, confident in her victory, the large screens around the ballroom suddenly came alive with Catherine's recordings. Her terrified voice filled the room as she described Jessica's threats and financial crimes. Bank records showing the fraudulent transfers appeared on screen, followed by Daniel's testimony. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Jessica's face went white, then red, then white again, as she realized her carefully constructed lies were crumbling in front of hundreds of witnesses. She tried to deny everything, claiming the recordings were fabricated. But when Daniel stepped onto the stage and Richard embraced his brother for the first time in 20 years, her denials rang hollow. The police were waiting in the wings. As Jessica was led away in handcuffs, she screamed accusations and threats, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers and gasps of the assembled crowd. The media that she had hoped would destroy Richard instead captured every moment of her downfall. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Jessica was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy in Catherine's death. The evidence Ben and I had gathered, combined with testimony from other staff members who finally felt safe to speak, painted a picture of a woman who had systematically manipulated and destroyed lives in pursuit of wealth and status. Richard's public apology to me came during a press conference 3 months after Jessica's arrest. Standing beside Daniel and Eleanor, he acknowledged that his grief and paranoia had made him blind to the truth. He described my actions not as inappropriate, but as heroic, the response of a trained medical professional who had saved his son's life. But the private apology, delivered in Eleanor's garden on a quiet Sunday morning, meant much more to me. Richard found me there, watching Leo take his first tentative steps across the grass. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion and regret. He offered me more than just words: a position as Director of Child Welfare for the Davenport Foundation, with a salary that reflected both my experience and the injustice I had suffered. A formal role in Leo's upbringing, with legal protections that would ensure I could never again be separated from the child I had helped save. The transformation in Richard was remarkable to witness. Reunited with Daniel and freed from Jessica's manipulations, he rediscovered parts of himself that grief had buried. He established a fund for LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected by their families, and he worked with mental health advocates to reform institutions that had damaged his brother. Daniel's recovery was slower, but equally inspiring. With proper medication and therapy, the brother who had been lost for 20 years began to emerge from the fog of institutional abuse. He found peace in gardening, creating beautiful spaces where flowers bloomed in patterns that seemed to tell stories of resilience and hope. Eleanor's role in our new family configuration was perhaps the most surprising. Free from the burden of keeping her family's secrets, she became the grandmother Leo had never had, and the mother figure I had lost when Emma died. Her wisdom and grace helped heal wounds that had festered for decades. Leo, now 2 years old and thriving, will never remember the woman who tried to hurt him, or the night his breathing stopped in my arms. He knows me simply as Sarah, the woman who reads him bedtime stories and teaches him the names of flowers in Daniel's garden. The Davenport Foundation has become one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country, funding research into pediatric care, supporting families affected by mental health issues, and advocating for transparency in institutions that serve vulnerable populations. My work there gives me purpose and allows me to use my experience to help other families navigate crises with dignity and hope. Jessica was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. I don't think about her often anymore, but when I do, it's with a mixture of pity and gratitude. Her actions were unforgivable, but they also led to the exposure of truths that needed to be told. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. It took courage to keep fighting when everything seemed stacked against me. But it also took the support of people like Ben and Eleanor, who believed in justice even when it seemed impossible to achieve. On quiet evenings, when Leo is asleep and the mansion feels peaceful rather than haunting, I often sit in Catherine's garden and think about the woman who died protecting secrets that ultimately saved us all. Her courage in making those recordings, even knowing the danger she faced, gave us the tools we needed to expose the truth. I am 54 now, and my life looks nothing like what I expected it would after losing Emma and Marcus, but it is a good life, filled with purpose and love, and the daily joy of watching a child grow into his own person. Leo calls me Aunt Sarah, and when he wraps his small arms around my neck and whispers that he loves me, I know that some gifts come disguised as tragedies, and some families are built not from blood, but from the decision to choose each other despite everything that tries to tear you apart.